The professor thought he had the upper hand. But Barron Trump was about to turn his entire worldview upside down. The air inside Harvard's historic lecture hall was thick with anticipation. The scent of old books and freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint hum of whispering students, all eagerly waiting for the arrival of Professor Elliot Grayson. His reputation was legendary. A man who prided himself on his intellectual dominance, particularly over students who dared to challenge his left-leaning ideology. He had a special talent for dismantling opposing viewpoints, and today his sights were set on one student in particular, Barron Trump. Seated in the third row, Barron barely looked up from his notebook as the professor entered the room. He was calm, composed, a stark contrast to the usual students who fidgeted nervously under Grayson's gaze. He had been in classes like these before, where professors masked their biases behind academic rhetoric. Grayson took his place at the podium, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses before clearing his throat. His smirk was barely concealed as he scanned the room. "Before we begin today's lesson," he said, his voice laced with amusement, "let's address something that's been bothering me for quite some time. The issue of merit, or, in some cases, the lack thereof." His eyes locked onto Barron, a deliberate act. The class followed his gaze, realizing exactly who he was referring to. A ripple of whispers swept through the room. "You see," Grayson continued, his tone growing sharper, "we live in an age where the privileged assume they are owed a place among the intellectual elite, despite demonstrating little to no real intellectual capacity." Barron remained silent, his pen gliding smoothly across his notebook. He didn't need to respond. He knew this game. He had seen it played before. Grayson's smirk deepened. "Some of you may recognize these types, the ones who coast into elite institutions on name alone, contributing nothing but the illusion of intelligence." A few chuckles echoed in the room, but Barron didn't flinch. He simply turned a page and continued writing. And that's when the professor's confidence flickered. He had been expecting a reaction, a defensive shift in posture, a glance around the room for support. Instead, Barron remained completely indifferent. The silence dragged on, thick and heavy. Grayson's jaw clenched. "Mr. Trump," he finally said, leaning slightly forward, "perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts. Or are you merely here to observe?" Slowly, Barron looked up. His expression was neutral, unreadable. Then, with measured calm, he closed his notebook and met Grayson's gaze. "I'm here to learn, Professor. Shouldn't that be enough?" The room fell completely silent. Grayson's smirk faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. He straightened his jacket, regaining composure. "Well then," he said, "I certainly hope you're up for the challenge." Little did he know, the real challenge was about to be his own. Barron had just done the unthinkable, challenged a professor in his own domain. But he had no idea how far Grayson would go to prove him wrong. The class buzzed with energy long after the lecture ended. Students whispered excitedly in small groups, some stealing glances at Barron, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Nobody had ever spoken to Grayson like that. The professor, known for his cutting sarcasm and unshakable confidence, had found himself momentarily thrown off balance, a rare sight that had sent ripples across the campus. But the storm wasn't over yet. That evening, in the dimly lit faculty lounge, Professor Grayson sat alone, swirling a glass of scotch as he replayed the interaction in his mind. He prided himself on being able to intellectually dismantle anyone who dared challenge him. Yet something about Barron's calm defiance irked him in a way he couldn't explain. "He's just another legacy student," he muttered under his breath, "a name with no real depth." But what if he was wrong? No, that was impossible. That night he devised a plan. a public intellectual challenge, something that would force Barron into a corner and expose him for what Grayson was certain he was, a fraud. The next morning, the tension in the classroom was palpable. Barron entered, taking his usual seat, ignoring the lingering stares from his classmates. But something was different today. Professor Grayson's stance, his posture. He wasn't prowling the room as he usually did. Instead, he stood rigidly behind his desk, a slow, satisfied smile creeping across his face. "Before we begin today's discussion," he said smoothly, "I have a proposal, a challenge, if you will." The students leaned forward, intrigued. "Since we're on the subject of economic theory," he continued, "I thought it might be enlightening to put two opposing perspectives to the test. A live intellectual debate, open to faculty and students alike, where one side will argue for the traditional capitalist model and the other, the modern economic evolution that seeks to dismantle it." His eyes found Barron, locking onto him like a predator. "Mr. Trump, since you seem so confident in your understanding of economic principles, I assume you wouldn't mind representing the capitalist side?" A few students gasped. Others snickered. This was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. If Barron accepted, he'd be going against one of the most celebrated economists in the country, a professor who had spent decades refining his arguments. If he refused, he'd be branded as a coward. But Barron's expression never wavered. He calmly folded his hands on the desk and tilted his head slightly, as if considering. Then, with the faintest hint of a smile, he said, "I accept, Professor, but let's make it fair." Grayson's brow arched. "Fair? If I win," Barron continued, "you publicly retract your claims that conservative students are intellectually inferior. And if I lose, I'll transfer out of your class." The class exploded in whispers. Grayson's smile returned, sharper than before. "Deal," he said, his voice practically dripping with anticipation. The trap had been set. Now all he had to do was watch Barron fall right into it. Or so he thought. With the entire campus watching, could Barron actually outthink one of the most respected economists in the country? By noon, the news had spread like wildfire. The challenge wasn't just some classroom debate anymore. It had become a campus-wide event. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards, students whispered about it in dining halls, and even faculty members couldn't resist weighing in. Many saw it as a guaranteed victory for Grayson. "The kid's smart, sure," one student said in the hallway, "but come on, he's going up against a professor who literally wrote the textbook on economic theory." Another chimed in, "Grayson's gonna eat him alive. It's one thing to take notes in class. It's another to go head-to-head with one of the most respected minds in the field." But there were also those who weren't so sure. "Have you actually heard Barron speak?" a junior in the economics department asked. The guy never loses his cool. That's not normal. Meanwhile, Grayson was reveling in the attention. For years, he had dominated intellectual circles, using his sharp wit and cutting rhetoric to dismantle anyone who dared to challenge his views. This was his moment, a chance to remind everyone why he was the best. But while Grayson was celebrating, Barron was preparing. He wasn't just reading books, he was calling experts. Late into the night, Barron sat in his dorm room, his laptop glowing softly as he spoke to business professionals, economists, and even CEOs. He gathered real-world insights, ones that went beyond theoretical models and academic arguments. He wasn't just memorizing facts, he was building a strategy. And when the sun finally rose, Barron was ready. It was supposed to be a one-sided battle, but as soon as Barron started speaking, the professor realized he had made a grave mistake. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity. Students lined the walls, some even sitting on the floor, just to get a glimpse of what was about to unfold. Professors from different departments filed in, murmuring amongst themselves. Even the Dean of Economics had taken a seat in the front row, his expression unreadable. At exactly 7 p.m., Grayson entered first. His confidence was unshaken, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he strode toward the podium. He was in his element, adjusting his tie as he surveyed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Tonight we explore the fundamental question of our time. Should capitalism be the foundation of our economic future, or is it an outdated system clinging to relevance?" He let the words hang in the air, soaking in the applause from his supporters. Then Barron entered. Unlike Grayson, he didn't stride in like a conqueror. He walked with calm, measured steps, his expression unreadable. He took his seat at the debate table, straightened his jacket, and quietly folded his hands together. The contrast was striking. Grayson, the towering figure of arrogance and experience. Barron, the composed enigma, unreadable, unshaken. The moderator, a respected professor from the political science department, tapped the microphone. "We will begin with opening statements," she announced. "Professor Grayson, you may start." Grayson's smile widened. He had been waiting for this moment. He launched into a theatrical speech, weaving historical data, theoretical frameworks, and cutting sarcasm into every sentence. His words were sharp, each one laced with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Capitalism is an outdated relic," he declared, "a system that rewards the few at the expense of the many. It is the illusion of meritocracy, wrapped in the chains of generational privilege, and the fact that my opponent is even sitting here today, based not on his intellect, but his last name, is proof of that." The room erupted in murmurs. Some students laughed, others nodded in agreement. Grayson leaned back in his chair, satisfied. "Mr. Trump," the moderator turned, "your opening statement?" The room fell silent. Barron adjusted his microphone, his fingers lightly tapping the table. Then he spoke. "Professor Grayson speaks of capitalism as if it were a disease, a flaw in human progress," he began, his voice steady. "But let me ask you this. If capitalism is so broken, why is it that every major technological advancement, every breakthrough in medicine, every leap in industry has come from capitalist societies?" The silence was deafening. Grayson's smirk twitched just slightly. "You claim capitalism rewards only the few," Barron continued. "But I find that strange, because I've spoken to those few. The factory owners, the entrepreneurs, the investors who risk everything to build something from nothing. And do you know what they all have in common? They started exactly where many of you are sitting, without wealth, without privilege, without guarantees. But through capitalism, through the ability to create, to innovate, and to compete, they changed not just their lives, but the world around them." The room was no longer chuckling. Barron leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto Grayson. "You speak of meritocracy as if it's a lie," he said. "But here's the truth. Meritocracy is only a lie to those who never put in the effort to succeed." A slow wave of whispers rippled through the audience, and for the first time since this debate began, Professor Grayson had nothing to say. The professor thought he was the smartest person in the room, until Barron revealed the one fact that shattered his entire argument. As the debate progressed, the atmosphere in the auditorium shifted palpably. What began as a battle of wits soon transformed into a high-stakes intellectual showdown where every word carried immense weight. Professor Grayson was confidently rattling off statistics and historical references, his tone sharp and unwavering. Yet a subtle misstep was lurking in his well-rehearsed rhetoric. Midway through his argument, Grayson quoted an economic principle, a cornerstone of his debate, that he had repeated countless times. The professor's voice boomed. According to the most recent studies on market efficiency, any deviation from these principles only underscores systemic failure. He paused, expecting nods of approval from the rapt audience. But then Barron leaned forward, his expression calm yet resolute. With measured clarity, he interjected, "Professor, if I may, could you please clarify your source?" His question was not posed in challenge, but as a sincere inquiry. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Grayson's eyes flickered in annoyance. "Certainly," he replied, his voice tightening. "It's a well-known study from—" Before he could continue, Barron produced a concise counterpoint. "With respect, Professor, the study you mentioned was retracted last year due to critical methodological errors. The current consensus, as supported by multiple independent analyses, actually validates a more dynamic model of market behavior that accounts for innovation and risk-taking." A hush fell over the room. The moderator's eyes widened in surprise. Students exchanged incredulous looks. Grayson's argument, once presented as an unassailable fact, was now crumbling under the weight of Barron's evidence. The professor's confident facade began to crack visibly, his voice faltering for the first time in the debate. The turning point was clear. What had started as a controlled performance was now veering into uncharted territory. Grayson struggled to regain his composure, his rebuttal now a jumble of hurried justifications. Barron's calm delivery and factual precision had not only invalidated the professor's point, but also highlighted the disconnect between outdated academic posturing and the evolving realities of the economic world. The audience, initially divided, began to lean noticeably toward Barron's perspective. Every head in the room now turned expectantly toward the professor, who was grappling with a stark realization. The very foundation of his argument had been shaken. This was no longer a debate. It was a complete dismantling, and the professor knew it. It was no longer just about winning a debate. The final moments would expose not only an academic downfall, but a personal reckoning. The final round of the debate had arrived. The stakes were higher than ever, and the auditorium was charged with an electric intensity. Grayson, desperate to reassert his authority, launched into a final barrage of arguments, his words now tinged with a note of desperation that had not been present before. Barron listened intently, then responded with measured calm. "Professor Grayson, throughout tonight's debate, you have insisted that intellectual superiority is inherent and unchallengeable. But the evidence speaks for itself. True intelligence adapts, learns, and acknowledges when it is in error." His voice resonated through the hall with an almost serene confidence that contrasted sharply with the professor's crumbling bravado. In that moment, Barron delivered the knockout punch, a succinct yet powerful summary of the debate. "Capitalism, as you denounce it, has fueled the ingenuity and resilience of countless innovators. To dismiss it as merely a relic of privilege is not only simplistic, it is dangerously out of touch with reality." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And true merit lies not in clinging to obsolete doctrines, but in embracing the continuous evolution of thought." The silence that followed was deafening. Grayson's face drained of color as he scanned the room for a hint of support, but found none. The audience had clearly shifted its allegiance. The moderator, sensing the gravity of the moment, finally stepped in. "The panel will now deliberate on these arguments." For several agonizing minutes, the tension was palpable. Then the panel announced their verdict. Barron had unequivocally won the debate. The decision was met with a thunderous applause that reverberated off the walls of the lecture hall. Grayson's humiliation was complete. Unable to face the collective disappointment of his peers and students, he sputtered out a weak retort, his words trailing off into silence. The man who had once commanded respect with his razor-sharp intellect was now reduced to a figure of public ridicule, his previous arrogance laid bare for all to see. In a final poignant moment, Barron addressed the audience with quiet dignity. "Intelligence is not measured by the ability to dominate a conversation, but by the willingness to learn from our mistakes and to evolve beyond them." His words, delivered without bitterness, resonated deeply with everyone present. As the hall slowly emptied, whispers of admiration for Barron filled the corridors. The professor, left alone with his shattered pride, was forced to confront a humbling truth: that in the quest for true knowledge, one must sometimes surrender ego for enlightenment. But what happened after the debate would prove that true victory isn't measured in arguments alone. It's reflected in the lessons learned. The echoes of applause had long faded, but the weight of the evening still lingered in the air. The lecture hall, once packed with students hungry for a spectacle, was now empty, except for two people. Professor Grayson sat slumped in his chair at the debate table, staring blankly at the polished wood in front of him. His hands were still resting on the podium, as if he could hold on to what little control he had left. He had lost. Publicly. Worse, he had been outmatched by someone he had dismissed as nothing more than an overprivileged student riding on his last name. The realization of it all gnawed at him, leaving behind a bitterness he couldn't shake. The doors creaked open, and Barron Trump stepped inside. Unlike earlier in the evening, where tension crackled in the air, there was now only a stillness between them. Grayson expected mockery, gloating, maybe even a smug smile from his victorious opponent. But instead, Barron walked over to the professor's desk and placed a neatly stacked set of papers on top of it. Grayson lifted his head slightly, brows furrowing as he glanced at the papers. "What is this?" he muttered. "Notes," Barron replied simply. "Your lectures transcribed. I took the liberty of adding some additional perspectives, ones I've gathered from my father's business experience, as well as economic advisors I've spoken to over the years. Thought you might find them interesting." The professor stared at him, speechless. Of all the things he had expected after his public humiliation, this was not one of them. There was no arrogance in Barron's voice, no trace of malice or triumph, just a quiet confidence that left Grayson feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Respect. Grayson hesitated before picking up the papers, skimming the first few pages. The depth of the analysis was undeniable. Barron had taken his own lectures and expanded upon them with insights that bridged theory and real-world application, something that, in hindsight, Grayson himself had often failed to do. For a long moment he sat in silence, flipping through the pages. Then, almost begrudgingly, he exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "You know, Mr. Trump," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual sharpness, "in all my years of teaching, I've never had a student challenge me the way you did tonight." Barron didn't gloat. He simply nodded. "I wasn't trying to challenge you, Professor. I was trying to have a conversation." Grayson let out a bitter chuckle. "Some conversation. You made me look like an idiot in front of half the faculty." "No, Professor," Barron said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "You did that to yourself. I just didn't let you get away with it." The professor flinched slightly, but instead of anger, something else flickered in his expression. Recognition. The room was silent for a long moment before Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "You know," he said slowly, "I spent years believing that intelligence had a political identity, that only those who thought like me were capable of real critical thinking. But tonight," he trailed off, shaking his head. He didn't have to finish the sentence. "We all have something to learn from each other," Barron said, a small, knowing smile forming at the corner of his lips. "Even those we initially dismiss." Grayson let out a tired laugh. "Is that your way of saying I should rethink everything I've built my career on?" he asked dryly. Barron simply shrugged. "That's up to you, Professor. But I think tonight proved one thing. Intelligence isn't about how many books you've read or how many degrees you have. It's about how willing you are to listen, adapt, and grow." The professor fell silent, staring down at the pages Barron had left for him. For the first time in his career, Elliot Grayson, the man who had spent years ridiculing students he deemed unworthy, was the one being taught a lesson. Barron turned to leave, pausing just before he reached the door. "By the way, Professor," he added, "your score in the debate was impressive. You should be proud of it. I just wish you could be proud without needing to tear others down." With that, he stepped out into the night, leaving Grayson alone with his thoughts. And there it was, the greatest lesson of all. In a world so quick to judge, so eager to divide, sometimes the most brilliant minds are the ones who choose understanding over arrogance, respect over ridicule, and wisdom over mere knowledge. If you believe intelligence should be measured by merit, not bias, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp.